your dog or your spouse or anybody else while we're recording this. And I'll start with a prayer that comes from Percy Dermer, who was an Anglican priest at the turn of the century. And lots of things were going on. We sing a couple of his hymns are in the hymnal 1982. And I thought this would be a good prayer to begin our series tonight. Let us pray. God, our shepherd, give to the church a new vision and a new charity, new wisdom and fresh understanding, the revival of her brightness and the renewal of her unity, that the eternal message of your Son, undefiled by human tradition, may be hailed as the good news of the new age through him who makes all things new, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So we'll go ahead and start in the Zoom. I introduced Barkley in the video. So what we'll do is we'll watch the video, and then at the end of that, we'll come back and we'll have a brief discussion, answer questions, clarify things, give feedback, and we'll do that for about 15 or 20 minutes after we've all watched the video. Does that make sense? Perfect. Nod heads. Perfect. All right, Deanna, you want to start the video?
Can y'all hear it?
No.
Okay.
She's working on it.
You're absolutely on mute. Does anybody lip read?
Very wonderful and powerful ministry. And I've asked Barkley to share some of his thoughts about that. Barkley is a prolific writer. We'll include in his bio for you guys some of the stuff that he has written. The best decision he made was to marry Jill, his wife, and they have 2 young adult children. So Barkley, thank you for being here. Welcome.
Thank you, John. It's great to be here. I'll add to what you said that at least for me, the first few years, it is really impossible for me to imagine the first few years of my ordained life apart from my friendship with you. We were probably insufferable back then, maybe insufferable now, but I feel pretty sure we were insufferable back then, but we were insufferable together. And it sure felt like we were right about everything. And all those older priests who just needed to get out of the way and let us do what we had learned how to do in seminary. So I appreciate that and honor it. And those years were very, very meaningful to me. And in both our cases, the bishop, our bishop at that time, gave us outsized responsibility for people right out of seminary. It was great to have a colleague to lean on and share experiences with. And then I would say to your new congregation now, I know of St. John's Montgomery from a couple of visits. I have preached there and done a Lenten series there. And they're just, in case they don't know it yet, they're really, really fortunate to have you. Nay, blessed to have you. I just think it's a match that's going to be made in heaven. And I'm just glad that you're there for you and for them.
Thank you, Barkley. Yeah, we were a lot smarter back then. We were right out of seminary than we are now, weren't we?
Yeah, it's weird. You mentioned my young adult children. You know, one of my kids is a sophomore in college, and he's a genius. He just everything. There's nothing he doesn't know.
That's right. Well, as I said, Christ Church is in the middle of downtown Houston. It has been there for 175 years. So it certainly has a rich history of witness and of proclaiming the good news. But I'm going to let you do a little bit more in explaining its setting, both as a downtown parish and its role in the larger community.
Sure. So Houston is, Christ Church is quite literally the oldest church in Houston. We're on our 182nd year now, and Houston was founded in 1837. And 2 years later, a group of laymen wrote to the Foreign and Domestic Missionary Society and said, "We've been begging you for a priest. We've now established ourselves as a church, and we're about to have lay presidency. We're going to have lay people celebrate the Eucharist once a quarter if you don't send us a priest." And apparently you could hear the wheels of the stagecoach peeling out from New York to send that first missionary priest. The good people of First Presbyterian Church here in Houston argue with us about who was the first church. One of the two started meeting first, and the other actually established first. And I can't remember which is which. Probably they started meeting first and we established first, being Episcopalians. We probably had the idea in our heads for a long time before we actually got around to doing it. But we predate the diocese. Christ Church is the second Episcopal church in Texas. And so we were a foreign mission of the Episcopal Church to the Republic of Texas, and go back that far. We're the only church in Houston of that vintage that's never left its original footprint. So Texas Avenue, if you've been to Houston, Texas Avenue is probably the main east-west thoroughfare that runs through downtown, straight to Minute Maid Park, where the Astros play. And that was the last border of the original plat for the city of Houston. That beyond there be dragons, right? In the old days. And that's the block we're on. So originally the church faced a different direction because it would have made no sense to face the open prairie. But we've been on this spot for going on 182 years now and never moved. There have been efforts to move. The last serious effort to move was right about a century ago in the late 19-teens, early 1920s. And the rector, who had been here 20 years, wanted to move to the edge of the suburbs. And after being voted down twice, he took about a third of the congregation and half the money and moved to what was then way out in the boonies. It's now Palmer Memorial Church, which is the church at the Texas Medical Center, which is in the middle of Houston. So it's funny how that works. But that was the last time. But the Christ Church has always maintained its dogged dedication to the urban core. And that's part of what attracted me. You probably recall that when I left Memphis, where I was, as you know, at a very suburban church and went to a downtown church in Roanoke, it was a sense of calling to be part of downtown ministry. And I'll tell you more about why I'm called to that later, probably. But the Cathedral has always been a destination church, not unlike St. John's Montgomery. I'm sure people drive in to go to the Cathedral. I think that they do that. They've always done that for two reasons. I hope now there's a third. They do that, one, because it's historic and beautiful, and they like that connection. Yours and my ordaining bishop, Don Johnson in Memphis, used to be fond of saying that we consecrate space by its use. And so Christ Church, like St. John's Montgomery, has had so many generations who have been born, raised, married, and died there. And their prayers breathe through the walls, I think. And so some people want to be part of that. But I think the second reason that people historically want to be part of Christ Church is our commitment to the downtown. Over 100 years ago, the Cathedral birthed DePelchin Children's Home, which is now its own nonprofit, which used to be an orphanage and now works with at-risk kids. 25 years ago, the Cathedral birthed New Hope Housing, which is now in the city of Houston, the largest single occupancy housing, supportive housing for those who've lived on the streets in the city, with over 1,000 units. And now we run the Beacon, which is the largest day center for the homeless in the city. And so it's that commitment to context. Sometimes the homeless walk into our services, and when they worship with us, no one bats an eye. But really, it's the congregation is made up of people who come from outside of downtown to downtown, but with a commitment to the downtown community. And I would say more than anything else, there are three large Episcopal churches in Houston: St. John the Divine, St. Martin's, which is the largest Episcopal church anywhere, 9,000 members, and the Cathedral. And I think in that sort of cluster, what defines the Cathedral is our commitment to those who live on the margins, particularly them.
Wonderful. So have you, since you've been there, have you developed a specific mission statement or vision statement or strategic goal toward that context to address that specific context?
Yes, we have, and I intended to have that on my other screen so that I could read you the mission statement, but it is in a paraphrase that is very close to accurate. Our mission statement is to proclaim the good news of God and Jesus Christ to the downtown, to the Christ Church Cathedral community, to the downtown, and to the Episcopal Diocese of Texas. Particularly in a pandemic, we take our role as Cathedral very, very seriously. And so we have tried, in addition to everything I've just said about downtown, we've tried to be a resource for particularly parishes in the diocese that don't have the resources to live stream services or to offer lots of robust online programming. We have been churning that stuff out, not just for our own people, but to try to serve the diocese. So that's our mission statement, to proclaim the good news of God in Christ to the downtown and to the Episcopal Diocese of Texas.
Perfect. And what do you think are your greatest challenges in being a downtown parish? I know enough about Christ Church that there's certainly been ebbs and flows of vibrancy and vitality and activity and membership. So what have you experienced as some of those challenges?
Well, you've named it to a large extent. There's this idea that as goes downtown Houston, goes Christ Church Cathedral. And there's certainly been periods of time where that were the case. The 1970s were a really, really difficult time for the Cathedral. It dwindled in membership. The story is there was a period of time where there were more people singing in the choir than there were in the pews. The end of that story is then came Pittman McGehee, my predecessor 3 deans ago, that a lot of people in the Episcopal Church know. He has probably spoken at St. John's Montgomery at some point in time. Pittman came in the around 1980 and was the dean for a decade and was a rock star in the church. And the church grew like a gangly teenage boy. It grew faster than its infrastructure could keep up with. And so that really has been the case. We have benefited that for the first time in a long time, the Cathedral is developing a geographic parish. One of the major, regardless of how downtown is doing socioeconomically or economically, as you know, downtown parishes in big urban settings don't have a parish.
Right.
And so people have to choose and want to drive in Houston, drive past literally 100 churches, including 6 or 8 Episcopal churches, to get to the Cathedral. And that's an inherent challenge. It's a challenge both for growth and vitality, but it's really more a challenge for community. Those other draws that I already talked about, they get people here. I mentioned a third. The third draw is we've really worked hard, and I've been here 8 years, and we've worked really hard to become a community of welcome. I'm fond of distinguishing between friendly churches and welcoming churches. Friendly churches are churches that have lots of inward-looking circles. Like if you walk into coffee hour at a friendly church, you're going to see lots of closed circles, and the people in the circle are being super nice to each other, and they're glad to see each other, but the circles are all closed. A welcome community is one where the circles are broken open, and people are looking at the door. I would much, it's weird for an Episcopalian to say, but as you know, I was raised a Southern rural Methodist, so maybe that's why. I am not worried about overwhelming newcomers. A lot of Episcopalians are worried about overwhelming newcomers. I don't think that's our problem. And so the welcoming congregation has its eyes peeled to the door and is looking for that person who walks in that they don't know, and is willing to go up and say, it's great to see you. Not as great to meet you, because invariably you've met that person before, but it's great to see you. I'm Barkley. Tell me about how you found the Cathedral. So we've worked hard at that. And I think, I don't think I'm fooling myself. I think we are a community of welcome. And so people are driving in, not so much now, but before the pandemic. I think the real challenge is how do you create community in a congregation? It is really hard to get, literally, again, in a unless you ask me about the pandemic, every answer I'm going to give you is in a non-pandemic world. Try to drive into downtown Houston to get to an event at the Cathedral midweek is not easy. Traffic-wise, it's not easy. Navigating the one-way streets of downtown Houston is not particularly easy. It's just really challenging. And so we have worked very diligently trying to, rather than just throwing spaghetti at the wall, trying to figure out what are the timeframes and what are the kinds of formational offerings that are worth the effort to get people into downtown Houston. Now, I will say something about the pandemic. I think the pandemic's changed all of that. I think the challenge will become in the next 6 months. The programming wise, the pandemic's been pretty good for us. I mean, we made the investment at the front end, which was already part of the capital campaign we were in, do the live streaming, to all of that stuff. And now, for instance, our Bible studies, I just as an example, I do a 7 a.m. Wednesday morning Bible study. When it was in person in downtown Houston, we averaged 15 guys, almost like clockwork. Since we've increased that by 50%. We average anywhere from 22 to 25 guys on Zoom because they roll out of bed, get their cup of coffee, and turn on Zoom. Well, now the question is, what 6 months from now, what do we do about that? We don't have the human resources or the time to simply double everything we offer and have an online version and an in-person. And I don't know about you, but any hybrid in-person Zoom thing that I do is awful. It's hard to crack that nut. And so I think the big challenge post-pandemic is for all of us that are at large-ish downtown churches is going to be, just as we figured out how to live into a new virtual reality, what does shifting back look like? And I have not figured that out. If you know the answer to that, email me. Let me know.
That's why I'm talking to you guys. Y'all are smarter than me. Okay, so when you arrived 8 years ago, I started September 1st in the midst of a pandemic to an incredible welcome and hospitable and gracious place. And so I have had a different experience in terms of transition, primarily because we were already kind of in the midst of living into this reality. It's not a transition that anybody trained for. And there's been some great benefits and graces to it and some big obstacles to overcome. But when you arrived 8 years ago, what was the biggest surprise? What was the thing that you found that you didn't know, and how did you navigate that in your first few months?
So that's a great question. I would say the biggest surprise personally was the realization that following a capable and competent and beloved predecessor is harder than following a dumpster fire.
Well said.
So in both of my prior parishes,
let's be clear, Robert's not a dumpster fire. That's not.
No, exactly. That's the point, right? You're going to face the same thing. So the first parish I served, Holy Apostles, had gone through just a long period of time in the wilderness, and had some challenging priests in various sundry forms over a long period of time. And then when I went to Roanoke, my predecessor there had served 3 years, and it was really remarkable how quickly he almost destroyed that place. I mean, it was in 36 months, the parish went from a vibrant parish to there being intrigue and a shadow vestry slate. And so my first set of meetings in Roanoke was a series of lay leaders who many came just to wish me well, but there were a small handful of lay leaders who came to say, just want you to know I'm leaving. I'm not sticking around. I'm not going to leave your first week because I wouldn't want to do that to you, but my bags are packed and I've got the letter of transfer filled out. And And the great thing about following a dumpster fire is you know what to do first. You put the fire out, right? And if you just put the fire out, you've really done good work, right? Here, I followed 3 deans in a row, about 26 or 27 years of really capable leadership. And so I realized there's no fire. I kept looking for the fire, and there wasn't a fire. And that is in itself an inherent challenge. What you realize at any parish is that rectors of lengthy tenure, they have an emphasis and a style, and something gets neglected. Something does. It's not active neglect. And the congregation may not even realize it's been neglected, because when the parish is otherwise healthy, people don't think to, not in a robust chorus, complain or even recognize what has atrophied. And so I started thinking about it in those terms. I spent about 6 or 8 months thinking about it in those terms. And what I realized was my immediate predecessor was super focused on outreach. He was here 12 years, and almost that entire tenure was spent buying up the city block across the street from us, building the beacon, launching the beacon, and then having a second capital campaign to pay down the much more expensive project the beacon turned out to be. And so for 12 years, the emphasis on formation, spiritual formation, Christian education, was neglected. And again, not actively so. And I don't mean to say that there weren't things going on. There were. But what I recognized as I really listened was that people were starving for formation. And so at 9 months in, I arrived February 1st, 2013. And in, I guess about 7 months, September, October of that same year, we launched a visioning process. And what resulted from that was, it's also the case that the parish had not grown in 12 years. It hadn't really shrunk, but there was no emphasis on evangelism or welcome newcomer ministries. And so really what came out of the visioning process was a hunger for Christian education and formation and evangelism, although they never would have put that word on it. In essence, evangelism. But I wouldn't have been able to figure out, it wasn't glaring, right? But there weren't neon signs with arrows saying this is what needs to happen. It was a much subtler and challenging discernment because I was blessed with capable, faithful, beloved predecessors going all the way back to Pittman. So really since 1980, the cathedral had, I don't want to say has had, because I don't want to grade the last 8 years, but until 2013, from 80 to 2013, really capable leadership.
So this isn't on the list of questions I said, but this is not, I'm not setting you up for failure here. What is your elevator pitch? You are out and you're out somewhere else in Houston and someone says, hey, tell me about the cathedral. What's your 60-second elevator? Why should they drive past all those churches? What is particular about the cathedral, the downtown Episcopal parish, that you tell them this is what you got to come see?
Yeah, so I some abbreviated version of those 3 things that draw people. I talk about our historicity and the legacy of the cathedral. I talk about our commitment to those who live on the margins, which really is, I've never seen anything like it. I take no credit for it, none, but I've never seen anything like it. It's what attracted me. I wanted to be part of a community with that kind of commitment. I talk about our welcome. I say that it is a place of welcome. And I now say it is a place where everyone is welcome. We had a street preacher this morning he's probably still out there out front with a microphone, just spewing Christian hate and doing everything he could to harass our people, as our 60 people, because we're limited to 60 people per service, 60 people coming into church at 9 and coming into church at 11. And I said at both services, 11 o'clock on the live stream, I said, I wish that everyone on the live stream could have heard the preacher outside, because he is the perfect advertisement for the cathedral. Everything you heard him say, the opposite was true of the cathedral. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter your walk of life. It doesn't matter who you love. None of that matters. If you want to know the God of goodness and grace at Christ Church Cathedral, come on in. I will take credit for having shepherded the community to that spot. We have moved as a community, really losing no one in the process. I mean, I'm sure that's not factually true, but we're a larger parish now, I guess I was the way to say that, than we were 8 years ago. And as we have come to embrace all of God's children, and so that's part of my elevator speech too.
Related to that, as a downtown Episcopal church in a large, super large, second, third largest city in the country.
Fourth, but we're supposedly gonna overtake Chicago in the next 10 years, I think. So soon to be.
So do you see your growth? Do you see more growth in Episcopalians or in people who are seeking a different and new relationship with God, whatever their tradition might have been before?
So there's obviously some of that shuffling of the deck chairs. And we see people leave in the same way. Obviously, it's not like we're just receiving, but there's always that. The two churches I mentioned, St. John the Divine, St. Martin's Palmer, and some of the others, even some of the smaller Episcopal churches, St. Andrews in the Heights, some of the really great neighborhood churches in Houston. There's some of that shuffling of the deck chairs all the time, usually when a new rector arrives, right? People leave or come when a new rector arrives. And that's just part of it. Sometimes you comb your hair the wrong way and people don't like it, or you, whatever. But we have also seen growth in folks who are not Episcopalian. And I will say, we had part of that visioning process in fall of 2013 was a doubling down on liturgy and worship. And you know me well enough to know I'm never going to be a bouncing ball praise band guy. It's just not in me. It would be inauthentic. And again, one of the reasons I was attracted to Christ Church is it would be authentic for Christ Church. Lakewood Church is in Houston, and they do that stuff really well. Why would we compete with Joel Osteen, right? I'm willing to compete with him theologically. I have no interest in competing with his worship style. So we developed a Celtic Eucharist that we call the Well on Sunday evenings. The liturgy we crafted using resources from the Iona community, the Prayer Book of the Church of Ireland, some other resources, the Northumbria community in England, Northern England. And then the music is all on cello, harp, and flute. Again, before the pandemic, that service averaged between 80 and 90 people on Sunday evenings. And the service that it replaced, which was a little chapel Eucharist at 5 o'clock on Sundays, used to average 20 people. So that's 60 people in worship attendance growth, 60 to 70. And that crowd is really interesting. They're people who are seeking not smorgasbord faith or buffet line Christianity, but something deep and rooted. Right one, evensong may not be their cup of tea, although it may become their cup of tea. But there's something about, and it's worth saying, there's a lot of Celtic spirituality that's not good and not rooted in tradition and not rooted in anything really. It's made up, and you got to be careful, obviously. But that's not what we're doing. This is stuff that is rooted in the St. Columba tradition and the Lindisfarne tradition, and I think that's what has attracted some of the new people who have come to worship at the cathedral. Is it's like when you and I were ordained, the emerging church was a big deal, right? And I remember a book came out, and some emerging church guru came out with a book, and the punchline of the book, like the denouement of the book, was that he put an altar on the stage. Like you move the praise band to the back and put an altar on the stage. And he meant like he was reclaiming tradition. And I thought, well, good Lord, if that's what people are attracted to, the Episcopal Church ought to be growing by leaps and bounds.
Right.
So I think it's really about, so sometimes when I talk to vestries, I will use the story when King Saul and his coterie are in the tent, terrified of Goliath. And David comes in to give his brother some cheese and bread or something and says, I'll fight Goliath, no problem. And so they put Saul's armor on David. And it's shiny, and I'm sure it would protect the wearer, and it's exactly the armor of a king, but David can't move in it because it doesn't fit him. It's not his armor. And to me, the wisdom of that story for a parish, especially a downtown parish, is you got to wear your armor, right? So it's not about figuring out what's the latest shtick that'll get people through the door. It's about how do you be you effectively and authentic. And our experience, I mean, now we're not growing exponentially, and who knows what will happen after the pandemic. I don't know if in-person church going patterns will ever return to what they were. Somebody said to me in another parish here in town, before the pandemic, we were a geographic church with an online presence. This rector said he suspects that after the pandemic, we'll be an online church with a geographic presence.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That may well be true. So who knows? But at least up until now, I think the key has been to be faithful. You got to wear your own armor. And for us, that has not been picking up on the latest trend. It's been diving deep into what the Anglican tradition has to offer and being committed to doing it well and intentionally.
That's great. That's a really, really helpful answer. Okay, a couple more questions, and then I'll let you go. How does the larger community of Houston view the cathedral? Do they view it as a resource? Do they view it as a spiritual anchor? Do they say, okay, let's see what they're doing at Christ Church, and we'll gauge what we do based on their response? What role do you play in the larger community? I guess both for Houston and certainly at the diocese, you're the cathedral, so that's a whole different set of expectations.
Yeah, so in some ways, St. John's Roanoke that I served had a larger footprint in the community than the cathedral was. Roanoke's a city of 120,000 people. St. John's is the large downtown parish. It is twice as big as the next sized Episcopal, maybe 3 times bigger than the next sized Episcopal parish. So St. John's that juxtaposition, St. John's has a really big footprint in the city of Roanoke. The greater Houston metro area is 6 million people, and the cathedral's a parish of 3,000. So, and Houston is not lacking in churches of any shape, form, or fashion.
And size and stature too.
That's right. That's right. So, in some ways, though, it's not so much our size or even the fact that we're the cathedral, although I think that probably has something to do with it. It is our historical role. So give you an example. The Houston Chronicle is going to be running an article next week on Lent and the way in which it seems like Lent never ended last year. And they called us. They probably called the Roman Catholic Co-Cathedral also, but we get that call a lot. I write op-eds. The book that one of the things that I have written is a book that includes some of those op-eds. And the Chronicle the Chronicle has never not run an op-ed that I have either written and submitted or written with colleagues and submitted. And so I think that the cathedral is known because it's worth noting that Houston, unlike some of the true cities of the Old South, like Montgomery, Houston doesn't preserve anything. And so the cathedral is not only the oldest church in Houston, it's one of the only the cathedral building is our third building. It was built in 1893. I'm not sure there's another standing structure in the city that's that old. And so we have our footprint is as much about the historical role that the cathedral has played. May Fete is our big first weekend in May festival. used to be a community-wide festival. There's a 5th grade boy and a 5th grade girl who are named the king and queen of the Mayfete. In the whatever year it would have been, Howard Hughes was the king of the Mayfete at Christ Church Cathedral. So the cathedral has that kind of historic role, in the city, and I think that's a big part of it. And we lean into it big time. I want us to have that kind of role. I want us to be seen, and I think we are to some extent, as the center of theological conversation in this city. We have a wonderful relationship with Brazos Bookstore, which is the largest independent bookseller in the city, where if they have in a speaker on a speaking tour that is anything even touching upon theology or religion, and they need a venue, a big venue, the cathedral seats 700 people, they'll bring it to us. And so we've had some really impressive speakers come through, which draws the city in. John Leach will come and speak on his book about politics and religion and Better Angels of Our Nature, and we fill the cathedral with people from the community. And then just real quickly in the diocese, I'm fortunate to serve with arguably the most effective diocesan bishop in the Episcopal Church. I mean, there are certainly others who could claim that, but I serve with a really good, really effective bishop. Doesn't mean that there are never wrinkles in that relationship. I think the nature of being the dean of a cathedral and having the bishop right across the street on our campus, of course, there are always wrinkles, or occasionally wrinkles, but by and large, we've got a great bishop, Andy Doyle, and he does allow the cathedral to be the cathedral. Again, during this pandemic, there have been times when he has put out notices encouraging parishes with a solo priest to give their priest a week off and everyone instead tune into the cathedral live stream, for instance. We've produced a couple of studies, a book study, a Bible study on Acts, a vacation Bible school since the pandemic that we resourced out to the congregation, really beyond the diocese, but certainly intended to resource the diocese. So in that ways, it's the cathedral's important. We also allow any Episcopalian in the Diocese of Texas who wants to be married at the cathedral can do that. That's your right as a Diocese of Texas Episcopalian. It's your cathedral, and we speak in those terms. Occasionally, people will come downtown for whatever reason, and they'll come to church at the cathedral, and they'll sheepishly say to me in the line, I'm a member of Trinity, but I'm visiting the cathedral like I'm going to tell the rector or something. And I say, look, the cathedral belongs to you. This is the church you can visit on occasion and not feel like you're cheap. It's your cathedral. It actually does belong to you. We are both a parish church, and were a parish church for 100 years before we were the cathedral. And 110 years, actually, 1839 to 1949, we were just a Christ Episcopal Church. And then in 49, we were named the cathedral. So we are a parish church with a parish community, but we're also the cathedral, and so it belongs to everybody.
So last question, and I will note, being the cathedral, I told Barkley before we started recording this, I'm looking at a ordination certificate where my father was ordained at Christ Church Cathedral and as a priest in July of 1954. And he is previously ordained as a deacon at Christ Church Cathedral. So I've got family ties to that place and appreciate its history. But that strikes me, that was just 4 years after it was actually named as a cathedral. So right before he went to seminary. Yeah. Pandemic, we have a pandemic, and you touched on this, so we don't know. Let's imagine that in May, we get to sit down with our staffs and say, okay, we know come September 1st, come post-Labor Day, we can go full out regular programming year, and we're going to look like a church is supposed to look before a pandemic. And let's imagine we get to do that. And we factor in which classes are online and which ones are in person. We do all that. To what extent do you reorient or adjust any kind of strategic goals and priorities given what we've learned in the last year? Not necessarily the details of what class is virtual and what's not, but the big goals as a downtown parish, how do you reorient that?
Yeah, so I am that I am not someone who generally thinks that God manipulates the goings on in the world. But I will say, occasionally something happens that makes me reconsider. In the fall of 2019, 6 years after the first vision plan was adopted, we did visioning for our next vision plan. Sam Candler, our colleague, who is the dean of the Cathedral in Atlanta, is fond of saying and taught me, every parish gets a new rector about every 7 years. Sometimes it's the same person, but it better be a new rector every 7 years, right? You have to vision, you have to you'll stagnate otherwise. And so we did that work in the fall of 2019 and into the winter. And about 3 weeks before the city of Houston shut down because of the pandemic, the vestry adopted our new vision plan. So we have this new vision plan on the books, what we hadn't done much with. And as the pandemic has gone on, we've recognized it's the right plan. It's the right plan for a pandemic world, and we think it's the right plan for a post-pandemic world. And it focuses on small groups. It focuses on a small cell group type formation, both with regard to head knowledge and heart knowledge, spiritual practice. That's a major emphasis of the vision plan. It served us really well in a pandemic. You know, who could have guessed? But the fact that we were already pivoting to that has helped. And I think whatever the new world will look like, that will be important. It also has an element that is focusing on in a way that is bolder than we have been in the past. Issues of justice and being willing to recognize that, as Jeremiah 7 says, God says through the prophet in Jeremiah 7, you better not go into the church and sing your songs and say, we're in the house of the Lord, if the widow, orphan, and alien outside your door are suffering about it. Worship is a derivative of justice and mercy, not the other way around. So it's got that. I think, if anything, our experience of the world these days demonstrates how important that is. And then finally, there's a section on the caring for God's good earth. Here we are in the oil and gas capital of the planet, not really of the world, but of the planet. And that's not going to change, at least not tomorrow. So we're asking the question, what does it mean? So here's the gray. We feed 300 homeless women and men every day, 5 days a week, largely on oil and gas reserves, or on the generosity of parishioners whose ability to give comes from their own oil and gas reserves. So we're not suddenly going to, there's that great picture from when the WTO was meeting in Seattle a few years ago, and a bunch of environmentalists were protesting, and they rowed out in their kayaks into Puget Sound to protest. And that's the picture that showed up like on the cover of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. And somebody astutely pointed out that every one of those plastic kayaks was itself a petroleum product. Right. Right. We live in a gray world. It's not black and white when it comes to that. But we're asking the question, what does it mean to care for God's good earth, even in a place like Houston? And so I really think there was something providential of which we were blithely unaware when we were doing that visioning, those emphases will still be the right ones in a post-pandemic world. I don't know what it'll look like. I don't have any idea what it'll look like. Right. We always do. I'm fond of parish vision plans, not strategic plans. I think the gospel and the Holy Spirit are so inherently unbox-inable that a strategic plan like a nonprofit or a for-profit would have is too constricting for a church. A vision plan, however, amplifies rather than narrows. And so it is broad enough that I think in a post-pandemic world we'll be able to shift and shimmy. But I think the vision is still right one.
That is great. Thank you.
If it's not, I may be sending you my resume.
I think you'll be all right. You'll be all right for now. You get rid of the oil and gas money, that's a different beast altogether.
Exactly.
Well, thank you for this, and it's been good to catch up and good to hear your wisdom and your humor and your authenticity. I think that's I hope that people who watch this take that home, that you are who you are, and that makes a heck of a difference too in pastoral, prophetic, and just pragmatic. And so I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for your ministry there and our time together, our shared ministry. Anything you need to say before you take off?
No, just as I have mentioned to you before, we really do hope at the Cathedral to lead a group to Montgomery in a
Yep.
post-pandemic world. I suspect it'll be into 2022 before we're able to do that. But I look forward to seeing you and the church and experiencing that great southern city.
Well, we will do our best to not be friendly, but be welcoming by then.
Awesome.
So thank you for that. Take care, Barkley. We appreciate it.
Talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Let's see. Only reason I went off mute.
Well, welcome back, everybody. What I want to do is just open the floor for a few questions and or responses. And there are a lot of people on this, so I want to make sure everybody has a chance to say something. So if you have a question and I can see or Deanna can see you, raise your hand. And all right, Radney.
John, explain the significance of why is Barkley the dean? Is that because it's a cathedral, whereas you're a rector?
Yes, the priest in charge of a cathedral is the dean.
Okay.
That's the tradition. And as a dean, they're entitled, their salutation is the Very Rev.
Well, you called it authentic. He's a great guy. Well done.
He's from Paragould, Arkansas, which is near Jonesboro. It's about 80 miles northwest of Memphis. It's in northeast Arkansas. So
Well done.
Will Hill.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very good. Sorry, I had a very long Zoom call today, and I totally ran out the power on my laptop, so I had to pivot. Anyway, when the Very Reverend Thompson said that they made use of or leveraged or their history, the church history, do you have an understanding about exactly what he was talking about? You had mentioned, and I think spoken quite eloquently, if all we do as a church at St. John's just to emphasize our history, then we are not doing the church much of a favor. However, I was intrigued by what Reverend Thompson had to say, that they incorporate their history in their outreach. And I'm curious to know what you heard when you heard that, John Leach.
Yeah, what I think he's referencing is their sense of the historicity of their sense of place, that they have been on that corner for 182 years. And so their history is not, their history is grounded in their location. And whereas there are very few churches in downtown Houston anymore, and they are there and they've stayed there. And so their historicity informs their ministry, because their ministry it surrounds them, if that makes sense. In other words, they're being grounded in that location for that long has always shaped what kind of ministry they do. And they predate the Republic of Texas. So if you know anything about Texas, that's an important fact.
I'd be interested to hear from the group if they're searching for something to say. In what ways do they see St. John's as having opportunities like a cathedral? And in what ways are we different from a cathedral? Because I think part of the discussion that's helpful is there's a cathedral in the downtown parish. Maybe there's things that we're like, yeah, maybe we could do that, or those are kinds of ministries that we could have. And then, well, but maybe not quite the same way or differently, or maybe we're not a cathedral. So I was just sort of wondering how people resonated with the analogy of thinking about St. John's either as a cathedral-like, or in what ways are there parallels with Christ Church in Houston that we can help us think creatively about what we do at St. John's. Marnie.
I feel like our, excuse me, our longevity.
You went on mute, Marnie.
I had turned it off. I accidentally turned it back on. Anyway, I said, I think our longevity makes the community and the other churches, period, look to us for leadership in a lot of things.
I'm with Marnie. I agree. We are effectively a cathedral church for Central Alabama. And we ought to step up and take that on.
I'll say this from the what it's worth category. I've heard in 20 years, probably a dozen times, people outside of the church that come to funerals or weddings, they call St. John's Montgomery's Cathedral. I have literally heard that.
And in our history, before the Advent was named as a cathedral, St. John's was the de facto cathedral. More than one bishop was consecrated here. More than one bishop of Alabama was consecrated here or buried from here. So we were the de facto cathedral prior to Advent.
Well, if we've been on the sideline, it's only because we've chose to take that course. But I mean, we are front and center, I think, the church and the Episcopal Church in Alabama.
So Jimmy, if I could just sort of encourage you to fill that out a little bit more. So in what ways might we need to think differently then to embrace that sort of identity than just we're an Episcopal parish that happens to be downtown? So how might we need to understand ourselves differently or think differently about who we are as a parish or the kinds of mission and ministries that we think about taking on as part of our identity?
Well, I mean, my approach to this is that being downtown means that we're not a neighborhood church, that we serve a lot of different kinds of people, a lot of different cultures. We truly always have. And we've had different cultures kind of control the church, but we've always had a very diverse population within St. John's that I think represents not only the community, but the state. And not everybody within the church has had a voice, but I think that's changing, and we're growing and maturing into that in a way that makes us more diverse and mature than any church in the state. I mean, I truly believe that. And I've always felt that we were growing in that direction. And we appear now to be accelerating in that direction. So.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I think you guys appreciate this as well. So I don't think this is news to any of you. But we have to be conscious that people make an intentional decision to drive downtown to come to St. John. We're not around the corner from anything that they're getting up and doing on Sunday morning, unless they're coming to the downtown Waffle House. But we're not a neighborhood church. People have to decide, I'm going to go to St. John's for X, Y, and Z. And we have to be able to communicate that, I think, with others about why we make that decision and why they should make that decision as well.
Excuse me. One of the things that he said that caught my attention was the matter of small groups. And for a number of years ago, I belonged to the Cathedral in Atlanta. And one of the things that they did, and of course it was a church of the Community of the Cross of Nails, which has its own connotation. But within that rubric, they had something called foyer, and it was small groups, I think four couples, either 3 or 4 couples, and we would meet together on one night a month for 4 months, and then break up and reform. And it takes some talent to create the groups and make sure that everybody is reassigned according to, et cetera, et cetera. But the effect was that in a fairly large church, when you went in on Sunday morning, there was almost always someone that you knew, someone that you had eaten with, somebody who had done the prayer that goes with the community of the cross of nails. And I found that one of the most rewarding things that I had experienced in a large church.
Thank you for that, Nancy. We are definitely working on establishing how we can do small groups that combine what Barkley said, not only the theological kind of the head knowledge, but also the spiritual formation and what that might look like. And so we're working in that direction. We're moving in that direction, and it's not. We'll get a lot of feedback and a lot more input from you guys on how that actually shakes out.
What I have experienced in the past in Alabama is that when you have these supper club groups, they always tend to grow beyond the small group size. When we tried it, in a manner of speaking, at Nativity in Huntsville, and when I got here, there was something called the Civilist Supper Club or something like that. But it was always more people than you could really accommodate in a fairly small home.
Other observations?
Yeah, I want to switch to the topic of where he spoke about the transients in the neighborhood. And one of my concerns is our comfort level when a transient walks in the door at St. John's, and how we welcome them, and what our comfort level is with them. And that's because of the girl that walked in 2 weeks ago. And she kind of rattled my cage, although I went later as you asked me to give her coffee. I went back and I introduced myself, and we went back and had coffee together. But my concern was I then put her back on the street. And I would like us to somehow get a connection with downtown Montgomery to say, how do we handle this? What is the best, what's the Christian thing? What's the human thing to do for people like this? Is it to put her back in the cold? Because it's not just our responsibility. To me, it's Montgomery's responsibility as well. And to partner with them to somehow say, hey, if this happens again, and we know it will, what's our best act? How do we handle this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Scott Walters, who is in a couple of weeks, the rector of Calvary Memphis, talks a lot about that ministry that Calvary does. Clearly, the Cathedral, Christ Church Cathedral in Houston, has established the Beacon Center, which is now an independent, multi-layered ministry for street folk. Whether they are perpetually homeless or temporarily homeless. And And so some of it would be for us to look at best practices in other places and see what they're doing. Typically in communities where it's successful, there is some civic involvement, but the majority of the involvement is cooperation among faith communities. Honestly, that's the most successful that I've seen. And so, yeah, we need to do some homework on that and figure out the best ways to deal with that. I'll also say that everything is not always exactly what it seems. I learned later that this woman had spent nights in the building. Not recently, but in the past, she had found ways to get in the building. And so one of the concerns on that Sunday was making sure she did leave, because she had come in before on Sundays and spent Sunday night, Monday morning in the church or in the building. So there are all kinds of dynamics involved in that. But I think we can study other places that have been doing this and see what works, what would work for us. Yes, Reggie.
We have $120,000 a year on average in outreach at our church. We give money to social service agencies, to welfare agencies, but we don't seem to ask anything in return. And it seems like we could have a directory of social resources which would have helped a person like Katie, where we could refer someone. We used to participate in a program called the Fish Program. We never knew who we were going to get a call from. But Ann and I early on ended up with a mother and 3 homeless children at the Dairy Queen out on the Mobile Highway. And what do? We were able to go to the Salvation Army, which immediately was helpful to us. And we ended up getting the lady an apartment, and the Salvation Army helped us do that. And then we ended up getting her a job. But it was only because my prior experience is dealing with the Salvation Army. And it seems like we could have a directory of some of the social services that we fund ever so smallly in our outreach program as a place to start. That's just a thought.
I think that's a fair point to an extent. If someone is at St. John's, they've already run through the Salvation Army. And so part of the problem is we are their last resort, not a step toward anything else. The majority of the people that we help have been run out of the Salvation Army or the shelters because repeated, they haven't lived up to the commitments and the promises that Salvation Army and other places have expected from them. So it's a catch-22 for us. It's not to be uncharitable or unkind, but they've also burned all the bridges at other places by the time they get to us. Very rarely does someone come to us as a first step to help them be relieved of their immediate concerns.
I thought I heard Dean Thompson say that they fed 300 people a day. When
The Beacon Center, yes.
300
Okay, not the church.
Well, the church, the Beacon Center is now it's an independent nonprofit, but it's a ministry of the cathedral, yes.
Okay. And we were talking about downtown neighborhoods, and we kind of Del Reyta is in the neighborhood. I mean, that's a neighborhood that would be an outreach community that is available. It's not just up Decatur towards east and south.
Yeah, I think that's an important part of our conversation strategically is what are we doing in terms of outreach for the community and what's most effective. I don't have the answer because I think that's a conversation that we all have to have, but I hear that as an important conversation to have.
One of the things that I really like is your question to him saying, what's your elevator speech? And when I was working, we had to have an elevator speech. If somebody said, where do you work? And I think it's important for us, it's important for me if somebody questions me about St. John's, of, you know, what's St. John's like, or what is it? Can I genuinely come out and describe St. John's as what it means to me? And I think that welcoming part, sometimes when people say, you know, I let them know I was at church, I have to make sure that I'm not sending out, well, I'm a goody good, I was down at church. I want them to get a better feel of the importance of church, and it's part of me, that it's not a thing to do. It's a way of giving who I am and living out who I am. So I think having an elevator speech that is part of me, not an outside poem or something, but something that really registers about what I feel about God and St. John's is important.
That's very well said, Katie.
There was an interesting article in the November, December 2020 Alabama Episcopalian of all the churches in Alabama that Jimmy wrote a letter, just a report, but every frequent, a large number of churches wrote what they were doing during the pandemic to outreach to their own community and try to keep people together. And it was really interesting. There were a lot of good ideas that John and I had spoken about this morning. It was just having things like, I know Ascension does rice and beans, but there was a pasta and peanut butter. And if somebody's homeless, and I mean, we could at least keep some kind of a basket of some things in the back of the church to give them something until, you know, they can get another meal. Just offer them something. But I mean, they had like chicken dinners that they worked for the community. They had I don't know, soups to go. They had a phone tree within the church where they divided 25% of the people in the church divided up the church and kept contact with the rest of the people. Because I called people on the directory and the numbers aren't accurate. So, you know, there are a lot of people out there that are listed in the church, but, you know, we might not be reaching them. And maybe if we did, they'd be more active. It's just a thought.
Well, I would love to fix all the problems with a magic wand. But there are multiple projects that obviously we're trying to reinforce those things, the infrastructure around our for lack of a better word, the infrastructure around our daily operations. We have to that point, and I just because I think it's fair to be transparent, we've had to do a whole lot of restructuring of our financial record keeping to make it compliant with rules that are applied in 2020. We have had to upgrade virtually all of our technology and our access to technology in the last year, and bring that on so that we can communicate and do the things we need to do in a pandemic. There are certainly things we need to do, like the membership system has been, some of you guys might be listed as prospects and not as members. I know that yesterday I looked up someone who's been a member here for years and they're listed as a prospect. So there's a terrible inconsistency in the way in which people have been entered into the system. And so at some point we have to take that on as a project to update all that. To your point, Anne, is that that needs a serious That needs work. And we'll get to that. And we need to do that. We need to have a director. We talked a lot about that at the parish retreat, at the vestry retreat, excuse me, about having a director, and we'll work on that as well. We have a new staff member coming on board March 1st, who I think is going to provide a lot of good leadership and a lot of organization, and we can probably expedite some of the projects because she will be very competent in doing so. But I also just want to not make excuses, but simply say, I've been here 5 months, 6 months, and there's only so much that we can tackle at a time. And we're trying to get to those things. I do want to say this about outreach, because I'm passionate about our role as a downtown parish. You guys know that. I've talked about this. That's why we're doing this series. And that comes with people who live on the margins. If you're a downtown parish, you deal with that population. To do that adequately and to do that in the most grace-filled and charitable way requires intentionality, and it requires a clear strategy and a plan of action. If we gave out, peanut butter crackers or bags of chips or fruit bars on a Sunday morning to 4 people, the next Sunday we would likely have 40 people. And we would not be prepared for that. And so for us to be able to serve the community that is most at risk, is we have to plan for how we would respond to the needs that are going to be before us, not really how to give out, for lack of a better word, kind of social band-aids, because that won't serve us well, that won't serve that community well. And so while it might feel helpful to do something small, and I'm not saying we can't do that, we have to prepare for something bigger, because that's the reality of that population. Something as simple, if over the phone we help one person with their rent, the landlord, that word gets out on however that network works, and we will get 6 to 8 calls within the next 2 days about people asking us to help with rent. And so to be prepared to help one person, we have to be prepared to help a lot of people. And that's with a feeding ministry, a clothing ministry, a job work ministry. And so I want us to dream big and look at that. I definitely do. But I also want to explain why we can't simply do something without creating a huge problem for us that we would be completely unprepared to respond, if that makes sense. And I've been in downtown parishes, and so I've been in suburban parishes. I've been in parishes in the middle of like a place like Ascension, and they're in the same boat. Fraser's in the same boat. They have to be able to prepare to respond to as many needs as they can, rather than just kind of a panacea approach.
Well, John, you're exactly right. There was a day when St. John's had the peanut butter brigade, where they made peanut butter sandwiches, put them in the refrigerator back in the kitchen, and people came in looking for sandwiches, and we had a flood of people. And with a flood of people, we started losing Mike's tools. So, I mean, you got to be smart about what you're aiming at.
And we could do it. We just can't do it. It just can't be done on an ad hoc basis. I guess that's my concern. Other questions? Well, please tune in. We got 4 more of these conversations. So you're going to hear this theme come up again and again, and you're going to hear how different people approach it. One of the rich parts about this series is it's not one size fits all. And so the reason we had multiple conversations is for us to be able to hear lots of wisdom from places and put all that in our thoughts, and then sit down and us have a conversation. Okay, strategically, how do we feed the homeless in downtown Montgomery? What is the way in which we can support and sustain that kind of ministry? And so you're going to hear this more and more in the next 4 Wednesdays. So please stay tuned to that. It's a very rich and deep conversation. Thank you guys for being here. Thanks for being open and thanks for asking questions. I'm going to read another prayer as we go to bed from a priest, Robert Rodman. Let us pray. O holy Jesus, who had no place to lay your head, watch with me in the night hours, I pray you. Calm my fears and relieve my anxieties with the blessed gift of sleep. Give me your peace and grant that I may wake refreshed in your service, who with the Father and the Holy Spirit rules all things. Amen. Thank you guys. Keep the faith. We'll keep listening. We'll keep seeing where God is calling us.
Hey, John, when Barkley comes for the trip from, with his parishioners, tell him to bring some of that oil and gas money.
Yeah, no kidding, right?
Sounds like they got plenty.
Yeah.
Y'all be good.
Take care.